Thanks for clicking enjoy the full story. I had just sat down with a cold beer after work when I heard it, a deep, splintering crack, followed by a slow, painful creak. Then the crash. I bolted outside, and there it was. Gordy Rusk's ancient wooden fence had finally given up on life. It didn't just tip over, it collapsed completely into my yard, crushing my raised garden beds, toppling my patio table, and snapping the legs of a bench I built last year. Gordy's backyard looked untouched. His side of the fence must have been braced by a stack of firewood, meaning all the weight came down on my property. I took a deep breath and walked over to his house. He answered after a few knocks, squinting at me like I was interrupting something. "Keaton," he said with a nod, beer in hand. I pointed at the wreckage. "Your fence just collapsed into my yard. It crushed my garden and half my patio setup." He leaned past me, peered at the mess, and shrugged. "The storm last night must have been worse than I thought." I frowned. "Yeah. So we need to figure out how to fix this. I assume we'll be splitting the cost?" Gordy snorted, then actually laughed. "Splitting the cost? Alice, it fell into your yard." I blinked. "Because it was your fence?" He took another sip of beer. "Yeah, but it's on the property line. These things happen. Just haul it to the dump and move on." I stared at him. "It crushed my garden and my patio furniture." He scratched his neck like I was inconveniencing him. "Look, I didn't tell it to fall over. That's just how things go. I'm not paying for something on your property." I felt my fingers clench. "So your plan is to let me deal with the whole thing?" Gordy shrugged. "It's not my problem anymore." I turned and looked at the wreckage again. Not my problem anymore. If that's how he wanted to play it, I'd make sure he regretted it. I spent the next morning cleaning up the mess in my yard. The fence was heavier than I expected, rotting but still solid in some places, warped from years of neglect. I cut what I could into manageable chunks and stacked the pieces off to the side, right near the property line. And that's when I got an idea. See, Gordy was wrong about one thing. His fence wasn't actually on the property line. The way our houses were built, his yard extended about 2 feet past the official marker. Meaning, the wreckage was still technically his. So instead of hauling it to the dump like a good neighbor, I did something better. That afternoon, while Gordy was out, I took every single broken board, splintered post, and rusted nail and neatly stacked them back on his side. It took an hour, but by the time I was done, his backyard looked like a junkyard. Then I waited. I was grilling dinner when I heard the shout. "The hell is this?" I turned and found Gordy standing in his yard, staring at the pile of rotted wood like it had personally offended him. Delilah, his wife, was standing on the porch, arms crossed. I took a sip of my beer. "Your fence?" Gordy's face turned red. "Why'd you put it here?" I shrugged. "Because it's yours." His jaw tightened. "You think you're real funny, huh?" "A little," I admitted. "But mostly, I just believe in keeping people accountable. You said it wasn't your problem anymore. Now it is." He stared at me for a long moment, like he was debating whether to start something right then and there. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and stomped back inside. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I opened my front door to grab the mail and nearly stepped right into the wreckage. Gordy had moved the entire pile back to my driveway. Not neatly, he'd dumped it like a trash heap right across the pavement. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the mess, my blood pressure rising. If that's how he wanted to play it, I pulled out my phone and made a call. Time to get the city involved. I wasn't about to spend another morning hauling Gordy's garbage off my driveway. So I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I called the city. I explained the situation to a code enforcement officer, a guy named Mason Hargrove. He sounded unimpressed at first, probably figured this was just another neighbor dispute. But when I mentioned that the rotting wood was full of nails, splinters, and likely a fire hazard, I finally got his attention. "I can send someone out this week," Mason said. "If the debris is on your driveway, that's a bit tricky, but if any of it extends onto his property, he might be in violation of waste management codes." Bingo. I thanked him and went about my day, waiting to see how Gordy would react when the city showed up. The inspection. 2 days later, a white city truck pulled up in front of our houses. Mason himself stepped out, clipboard in hand, and took one long look at the pile of wood on my driveway. I was already outside, pretending to water my lawn. Gordy, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Mason nodded at me. "You the one who called?" "That's me." I gestured at the mess. It was originally his fence. It fell into my yard, but when I returned it, he dumped it all here. Mason made a thoughtful noise and snapped a few pictures. "You got a property map?" I had printed one out earlier. I handed it over and Mason studied it, tracing the lines with his pen. "Yeah, it looks like part of this pile is actually on his land," he muttered. "Which means he's responsible for disposal." I smirked. "That's what I figured." Mason sighed. "All right, I'll issue him a warning. He's got 72 hours to clear it, or he gets fined." Perfect. Gordy's reaction. An hour later, Gordy stormed over to my driveway. "You got the city involved?" he growled, jabbing a finger at me. I crossed my arms. "I don't know what to tell you, Gordy. They didn't like that you turned my driveway into a landfill. You're a real piece of work, Keaton." I raised an eyebrow. "You dumped it here. You could have just cleaned it up." He gritted his teeth, muttered something under his breath, and stomped back inside. I expected him to clear the mess and move on. I underestimated how stubborn he really was. Because later that night, I heard the sound of power tools. The next morning, I woke up, stretched, and walked outside, only to freeze in my doorway. Gordy had built a fence. Not a real one, just a haphazard, Frankenstein's monster of a barricade, made entirely from the broken pieces of his old fence. He'd lashed planks together with zip ties and rope, propped them up with buckets of gravel, and somehow wedged the whole thing along the property line like a makeshift blockade. It looked like a haunted house prop. And the best part? It was completely on his property. I let out a slow breath. All right. If that's the game we're playing now. I pulled out my phone. Time to call the HOA. I'm not the type to run to the homeowners association over every little thing. Truth be told, I don't even like them. But as I stood there staring at Gordy's junkyard barricade, I figured if he wanted to play stubborn, I'd let the system deal with him. I called Lyle Carter, one of the HOA board members, and he picked up on the third ring. Keaton? Everything all right? I smirked, watching the wind rattle a loose board on Gordy's mess of a fence. Depends. You know anything about property aesthetics violations? Lyle sighed, like he already knew where this was going. What did Gordy do this time? Why don't you come take a look? Later that afternoon, Lyle rolled up with 2 other board members, Marcia and Craig, in their HOA golf cart-looking mobile. The second they saw the so-called fence, Marcia made a disgusted noise. What in the world is this? She muttered. Craig pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. That's gotta be a violation. Lyle sighed like a man who had dealt with Gordy one too many times. Let's talk to him. I leaned against my porch, arms crossed, as they marched up to Gordy's front door. A moment later, he stepped out, beer in hand, looking as casual as ever. Mr. Rusk, Lyle started, pinching the bridge of his nose. Can you explain this? He gestured at the mess behind him. Gordy took a long, slow sip of his drink before answering. Sure. City said I had to get rid of the debris. So I reused it. Marcia's mouth twisted in horror. This is not an acceptable fence. It's on my property, Gordy said with a shrug. AITA doesn't own my land. Craig folded his arms. We don't own it, but we have rules. This is an eyesore, and it violates at least 3 HOA policies on fencing standards, material use, and structural integrity. Gordy didn't even blink. Well, that sounds like your problem, doesn't it? I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Lyle exhaled hard, clearly running out of patience. You have 1 week to remove this structure, or the HOA will issue fines. If you refuse, we'll escalate the matter to legal action. For the first time, Gordy's expression changed. Just for a second, his eye twitched, barely noticeable. Lyle didn't wait for a response. He turned, nodded at me, and walked off with the others. Gordy watched them go, silent. Then, slowly, he turned and locked eyes with me. You're really enjoying this, huh? I let out a slow breath and smirked. Little bit. He muttered something under his breath and stomped back inside. I should have felt satisfied. I had him cornered. The city was on him, the HOA was threatening legal action, and all he had to do was suck it up and get rid of the mess. But something about the way he walked off, the tension in his shoulders, told me one thing. Gordy wasn't done yet. And I had a feeling he was about to do something really, really stupid. For the next couple of days, Gordy didn't do a damn thing to remove his trash pile fence. No hammering, no sawing, no signs of effort. Just radio silence. I figured he was either ignoring the HOA's warning or cooking up something worse. Then late one night I heard the sound of spray paint. I looked out my window, and there he was, Gordy, with a can of bright red paint, tagging the wooden boards like some kind of lunatic. By the time morning rolled around, his Frankenstein fence had transformed into a neon red, barely legible protest sign. Hoa tyrants go to hell. Property rights equals freedom. Keaton is a snake. That last one made me laugh. I had officially entered Gordy's villain origin story. By the time I stepped outside, a few of the neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, staring at the eyesore. Margie Callahan from 2 doors down crossed her arms and whistled. Well, that's subtle. Todd, the guy across the street, shook his head. Dude's lost it? I was about to say something when Gordy stormed out of his house, holding up his phone. Guess what, Keaton? He called out, loud enough for half the block to hear. You want to sick the HOA on me? Fine. But I've got news for you. I went and started a petition. I raised an eyebrow. A petition? That's right, he said, grinning like he just cracked the Da Vinci Code. I went door to door, talked to folks, and guess what? Half the neighborhood agrees that the HOA is a joke. Now that was interesting. I had assumed everyone would be on my side, but as I glanced around, I saw a few familiar faces looking awkwardly away. Some people were nodding along with him. Margie cleared her throat. Look, nobody likes the HOA, but this? She waved at the mess behind him. This is a bit much. Gordy shrugged. I'm making a point. Todd sighed. And the point is what, exactly? That people like Keaton can't just run to the city or the HOA every time they don't get their way? Gordy jabbed a finger at me. He thinks he can tell me what to do with my property? Screw that. I rolled my eyes. It's not about the HOA, Gordy. It's about the fact that you dumped your trash in my yard and refused to clean it up. A real neighbor wouldn't have made a fuss, he shot back. A real neighbor wouldn't have dumped his garbage in my driveway in the first place, I said. That shut him up, but only for a second. Then he turned back to the growing crowd. Look, I get it. Some of you might not like my fence, but at least I'm standing up for property rights. And guess what? I'm not paying a damn fine. Lyle, the HOA board member, chose that exact moment to roll up in his golf cart, looking half annoyed, half exhausted. He took one look at the mess and exhaled like a man who was seriously considering early retirement. Jesus, Gordy, he muttered. What the hell is this? Gordy grinned. A protest? Lyle rubbed his temples. You've got 2 days to take it down before we start escalating. Gordy shrugged, completely unfazed. Guess I'll see you in court. And with that, he turned and strolled back into his house like some kind of martyr. The crowd slowly started to disperse, but I could already feel it. The neighborhood was splitting down the middle. Some folks were whispering to each other, clearly entertained by the drama. Others were giving me weird looks, like I had somehow caused this. Todd clapped me on the shoulder. Man, I hope you know what you've started. Margie chuckled. Yeah. Because this is only gonna get worse. I had a feeling she was right. For the next 2 days, Gordy did exactly what I expected him to do, absolutely nothing. The red spray-painted disaster of a fence stayed right where it was, a monument to his stubbornness. Every time I walked outside, I caught glimpses of neighbors whispering, shaking their heads, or taking pictures. The whole neighborhood was buzzing, and somehow, I had become public enemy number 1 to half of them. Margie stopped by on my lawn the morning of the deadline, coffee in hand. So, think he'll actually take it down? I shook my head. No chance. Todd wandered over, rubbing his jaw. So what happens now? Now, I sighed. The HOA does what they always do. They send a letter. And sure enough, that afternoon, Lyle rolled up with an official HOA warning taped inside a plastic sleeve. He knocked, waited, and when Gordy didn't answer, he stapled it right to the damn fence. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. Maybe once he saw the fine in writing, he'd swallow his pride and take the damn thing down. But then I saw Gordy step outside, read the notice, and laugh. He peeled it off, crumpled it in his fist, and walked back inside like it was a parking ticket in a city he never planned to visit again. That was when I realized something. He wasn't just being petty. He was enjoying this. The dumpster stunt. That night, I woke up to the sound of an engine rumbling outside my house. Not a car. Something bigger. I pulled on a sweatshirt, stepped onto my porch, and immediately froze. Gordy had rented a goddamn dumpster. And not one of the little ones, either. A full-sized industrial dumpster, right in the middle of his front yard. He was standing beside it, arms crossed, looking way too smug for a man who had clearly lost his mind. I just stared at him. What the hell is this? He grinned. You didn't like my fence. So I figured, why stop at a fence? I blinked. You rented a whole dumpster? Yep. He patted the rusted metal like it was a prize-winning horse. Thought I'd do some cleaning. Figured I'd start with this. And before I could even process what he was doing, he grabbed a chunk of his barricade and chucked it inside. The sound echoed down the block. A light turned on in the house across the street. Then another. Curtains twitched. More neighbors came outside. Todd and Margie, already in their pajamas, walked over looking half awake, half incredulous. Todd rubbed his eyes. Is that a damn dumpster? Gordy threw another chunk of fence inside. Bang. Sure is. Margie let out a slow whistle. I gotta say, this is bold. I shook my head. This is insane. Nah, Gordy said. It's practical. He pointed at me. You wanted the mess gone. Now it's going on my terms. Todd frowned. You do realize the HOA is gonna fine you for having a dumpster sitting in your front yard, right? Gordy shrugged. Not if I claim it's temporary. I ran a hand down my face. You're making this worse for yourself. Am I? He tossed another board into the metal bin, grinning like an idiot. Bang. I turned to Todd and Margie. Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me this is crazy. Oh, it's crazy, Margie said, sipping her coffee like she was watching primetime TV. Todd nodded. Yeah, but like, entertaining crazy. Gordy smirked. See? People are on my side. I sighed. No, people are watching because they can't look away from a train wreck. He just laughed. Well, you better buckle up, Keaton. 'Cause I'm just getting started. And the worst part? I believed him. For the next 2 days, Gordy kept tossing junk into that dumpster like he was hosting the world's worst block party. At first, it was just the fence. Then he started dragging random crap from his garage. Old tires, a busted lawnmower, what looked like half a couch. By the end of the second day, his entire front yard looked like a landfill. Neighbors were pissed. The HOA was livid. And me? I was just waiting for the inevitable. I didn't have to wait long. On the morning of day 3, I stepped outside to see 2 things. 1. A city code enforcement officer standing in Gordy's yard, hands on his hips, shaking his head like he'd seen some things in his career, but this was new. 2. A tow truck, reversing toward the dumpster. Lyle, the HOA board member, stood off to the side, arms crossed, looking deeply satisfied. Gordy? Gordy was losing his mind. You can't take my dumpster, he was shouting. It's my property. The city guy sighed, clearly already done with this conversation. Sir, you don't have a permit for it. And even if you did, you can't just pile garbage in your front yard. It's not garbage, Gordy snapped. A violation, the guy finished. You got 2 options. Either we haul this out now, or you start paying daily fines. Gordy clenched his jaw. For a second, I thought he was actually going to throw hands with a government employee. But then the truck hitched up the dumpster, and he just stood there, watching as his entire monument to stubbornness was dragged away. I swear to God, it was almost poetic. Lyle turned to me as the dumpster rumbled off. Well, that's one way to handle things. I smirked. Told you he'd make it worse for himself? Gordy turned, eyes burning holes into me. This isn't over, he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. Dude, it's so over. And deep down, I think he knew it. The aftermath. Over the next week, the city hit Gordy with every fine they could throw at him. Improper waste disposal. Property neglect. Failure to comply with HOA guidelines. By the time it was all said and done, he owed thousands. He tried to fight it. Tried to argue, appeal, whatever. It didn't matter. The dumpster was gone. His yard was finally cleared. And the fence? Well, in the end he had to replace it with a regulation-approved, HOA standard wooden one. It looked fantastic. Todd and Margie stopped by the day it was finished. Margie whistled. Gotta say, Keaton, you really played the long game on this one. Todd smirked. Think he's learned his lesson? I looked across the yard, where Gordy was sulking on his porch, staring at his brand new fence like it personally betrayed him. I chuckled. Not a chance. But at least now, he had no choice but to deal with it. And I could finally enjoy my damn yard in peace.